The morning of November 27, 2025 should have been peaceful. Across America, families gathered around warm tables, children pressed their faces against windows watching parade floats drift by, and the scent of roasting turkey filled millions of homes. It was Thanksgiving, a day meant for gratitude, for reflection, for unity. But something felt wrong. Something sharp cut through the air like a knife through silence. Inside kitchens from coast to coast, televisions suddenly blazed with breaking news alerts. Phones vibrated violently across countertops, interrupting prayers, shattering the quiet morning calm. And then America heard her voice. Ilhan Omar, congresswoman from Minnesota, had launched a blistering, furious attack on President Donald J. Trump, the 45th and now 47th President of the United States. Her words exploded across social media like grenades. Trump's threat to kick me out of America is trash, she wrote on X, formerly Twitter. He is a coward hiding behind lies. The words hung in the digital air, poisonous, inflammatory, deliberate. Families froze mid-bite. Grandmothers gasped. Veterans stared at their screens in disbelief. Children looked up at their parents, confused, sensing something terrible had happened but unable to understand what. The peaceful Thanksgiving morning shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. And deep inside the Oval Office, where the morning light streamed through tall windows and painted golden rectangles across the presidential seal woven into the carpet, Donald Trump sat at the resolute desk. Before him lay a freshly signed document, the ink still damp, the gold presidential seal gleaming under the soft overhead lights. The America First Expulsion Order, one of the strongest, most comprehensive immigration directives in modern American history. A directive aimed at rooting out fraud, corruption, and those who had abused the generosity of a nation that had welcomed them with open arms. Trump had spent the early morning hours reviewing the final language, discussing implications with his senior advisors, ensuring every legal detail was airtight. He had signed it with deliberate care, knowing the storm it would create, knowing the resistance it would face, but believing with every fiber of his being that America deserved leaders who respected her, citizens who honored her, and laws that protected her sovereignty. Then Omar's tweet landed. The Oval Office door opened quickly, almost too quickly. A senior advisor stepped inside, breathless, his face pale. "Sir, she called you a coward." Trump looked up slowly. His expression didn't change immediately. No sudden anger, no explosive reaction. Instead, something colder settled over his features, something calculating, something that those who knew him best recognized as far more dangerous than rage. "What did she say exactly?" Trump asked, his voice low, controlled. The advisor swallowed hard. "She called your expulsion order trash. She said you're a coward hiding behind lies." For a long moment, Trump said nothing. He simply stared at the document before him, at the seal, at the words that promised to protect American values. Outside, the sky over Washington began to darken. Heavy clouds rolled in from the east, blocking the morning sun, casting shadows across the White House lawn. Even the birds seemed to fall silent, as if nature itself sensed the gathering storm. Trump leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The Secret Service agent standing near the door shifted slightly, sensing the tension building in the room like pressure before a tornado. Marine sentries outside the West Wing straightened their postures, their instincts telling them something significant was about to happen. "Where is she right now?" Trump asked quietly. "Minnesota," the advisor replied. "In her office." Trump nodded slowly. "Is she watching the news?" "Everyone's watching the news, sir." "The reaction to her tweet is massive. People are upset. Really upset." Trump's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But still he didn't explode, didn't shout, didn't rage. Instead, he stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the darkening sky. Behind him, the advisor waited, barely breathing. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, each second stretching like an eternity. What Trump didn't know yet, what no one in that room could have predicted, was that this moment would become one of the most emotionally charged confrontations in American political history. A moment that would leave millions in tears, would shake Omar to her core, and would remind an entire nation what true leadership looked like. But before Trump responded, before the nation witnessed what would happen next, something heartbreaking was unfolding across the country. In Minnesota, In the very community Omar claimed to represent, young families who had fled war-torn countries, who had arrived in America with nothing but hope and gratitude, sat in their modest homes watching the news with tears streaming down their faces. Why would she do this? A mother whispered in Somali, clutching her young daughter close. This country saved us. Why would she attack it on Thanksgiving? Her husband, a taxi driver who worked 14-hour days to provide for his family, shook his head slowly. She doesn't speak for us. Not anymore. In Ohio, an elderly woman named Margaret, whose son had died in Afghanistan defending American freedom, sat alone in her small living room. The television replayed Omar's words over and over. Margaret's hands trembled as she held her son's folded flag, the one they had presented to her at his funeral. Why does she hate this country so much? Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. After everything we've lost, after everything we've given. Her tears fell onto the glass case protecting her son's medals. In Texas, a little girl no more than 7 years old tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, why is that lady calling our president trash?" The father, a construction worker with calloused hands and a proud American flag tattooed on his forearm, had no answer. He simply pulled his daughter into his arms and held her tight, unable to explain the inexplicable. People weren't just shocked. They weren't just angry. They were hurt. Deeply, profoundly hurt, as if something sacred had been violated on a day meant for thankfulness. Social media erupted, not with political arguments or partisan talking points, but with raw, genuine emotion. Veterans posted pictures of fallen comrades. Immigrants shared stories of their journey to America and their gratitude for the opportunities they'd received. Teachers, nurses, firefighters, ordinary Americans from every walk of life expressed their pain at seeing their country disrespected on Thanksgiving Day. And inside Omar's congressional office in Minnesota, panic was beginning to set in. Her communications director stared at his computer screen, watching the backlash build like a tidal wave. "Congresswoman," he said carefully, his voice tight with worry. "This is bad. This is really bad. The reaction is unlike anything I've seen." Omar paced the room, chewing her thumbnail, her confidence from just minutes earlier beginning to crack. "He won't respond," she said, though her voice wavered. "Trump never responds to everything. He's probably focused on Thanksgiving. He'll ignore it." Her senior advisor, a woman who had been with Omar since her first campaign, looked up from her phone. Her face was ashen. "Congresswoman, he just called an emergency briefing." "What?" Omar stopped packing. "When? Now he's speaking live in minutes." The blood drained from Omar's face. "No, he wouldn't, not on Thanksgiving. He doesn't do live addresses unless something major happens." The advisor's hands shook as she pulled up the breaking news alert on her tablet. "Breaking. President Trump to address nation shortly. Expected to respond to Rep. Omar's comments." Omar grabbed the edge of her desk to steady herself. "What have I done?" she whispered, so softly that no one else heard. But the question hung in the air nonetheless, heavy with the weight of impending consequences. Back at the White House, Trump had made his decision. The cameras were being prepared. The press corps, many of whom had been sent home early for the holiday, were being urgently recalled. Technicians rushed through the West Wing, setting up lighting, checking audio levels, ensuring every American would hear what the president was about to say. In the small private dining room adjacent to the Oval Office, Trump stood alone for a moment. Melania had called from Mar-a-Lago, her voice concerned but supportive. "Be yourself," she had told him. "Speak from your heart. America is listening." Trump loosened his tie slightly, rolled his shoulders, and took a deep breath. He wasn't nervous. After decades in the public eye, after facing every imaginable attack and criticism, nervousness was a foreign concept. But he felt something else, something deeper, a profound sense of responsibility. He was about to defend not just his policies, not just his presidency, but the very soul of the nation he loved. An aide knocked softly on the door. "Sir, 2 minutes." Trump nodded. He picked up the thin folder from the side table. Inside were documents that could destroy Omar's career, revelations that had been quietly investigated for years, evidence of irregularities and questionable actions that many suspected but few could prove. He had resisted releasing them before, preferring to let the legal process work, preferring to maintain some semblance of decorum. But she had crossed a line. On Thanksgiving Day, she had called America trash. The gloves were coming off. Trump walked toward the press room, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. Secret Service agents fell into formation around him. Staff members paused in their work, watching him pass, sensing the gravity of the moment. Even the most hardened political operatives, people who had seen everything, felt a chill run down their spines. In living rooms across America, families abandoned their Thanksgiving preparations. Mothers called out to their children to come watch. Fathers turned up the volume. Grandparents leaned forward in their chairs, reading glasses perched on their noses. Something was about to happen, something big, something that would be remembered. The press room doors opened. Camera flashes erupted like lightning. Reporters, some still wearing casual holiday clothes, scrambled to their positions. The room fell silent as Trump approached the podium. He wore no jacket, just a crisp white dress shirt and his signature red tie. The effect was striking. He looked like a man who had rolled up his sleeves to do difficult, necessary work. Trump placed the folder on the podium and looked directly into the camera, not at the reporters, not at his staff, but through the lens into the eyes of every American watching. "My fellow Americans," he began, his voice deep and measured, each word landing with deliberate weight. "You deserve to know the truth about what happened this morning." In Minnesota, Omar stood frozen in front of her office television. Her staff gathered around her, equally transfixed. No one spoke. No one moved. Trump continued, his tone carrying a sadness that millions would later describe as heartbreaking. "On this beautiful Thanksgiving Day, when American families should be celebrating their blessings, when children should be laughing and playing, when we should all be reflecting on the incredible gift of living in the greatest nation on earth, we were attacked, not by a foreign enemy, not by terrorists, but by one of our own elected officials." Across the country, viewers felt their throats tighten. Some reached for tissues. Others grabbed the hands of loved ones sitting beside them. Trump's words weren't inflammatory. They weren't designed to incite. They were simply painfully honest. "Congresswoman Ilhan Omar called my America First expulsion order trash," Trump said, his voice hardening slightly. "She called me a coward. She suggested that protecting American sovereignty, ensuring our immigration system has integrity, and demanding that our leaders respect this nation is somehow wrong." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the audience. "But here's what she doesn't understand, or perhaps refuses to understand. When she attacks me, she's not just attacking Donald Trump. She's attacking every American who believes this country deserves respect. She's attacking you." Omar's knees buckled. She grabbed the back of a chair, her fingernails digging into the leather. Her communications director whispered frantically into his phone, trying to coordinate some kind of response, but he was drowning in a flood he couldn't control. Trump leaned forward slightly, his eyes boring through the camera lens. "For years, this nation has opened its doors to people from around the world. We've welcomed refugees. We've provided opportunities. We've offered safety, freedom, and hope. And what do we ask in return? Very little. We ask that you respect America. We ask that you appreciate what you've been given. We ask that you honor the country that saved your life." His voice cracked almost imperceptibly, a tiny fracture in his usually unshakable composure. It was that crack, that momentary vulnerability that broke the dam for millions of viewers. Grown men cried. Tough veterans wept openly. Mothers sobbed into their hands, because they heard in Trump's voice something they rarely heard from politicians: genuine love for his country. "Is that too much to ask?" Trump continued, recovering his steady tone. "Is it too much to expect gratitude instead of hatred, respect instead of insults, loyalty instead of contempt?" The silence in homes across America was deafening. Even those who had never supported Trump, even those who had spent years criticizing him, felt something shift inside them. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was about something far more fundamental. It was about honor, about dignity, about the basic human decency of saying thank you to a country that had given everything. Trump picked up the folder. The camera zoomed in slightly, though the contents remained hidden. "What I'm holding," Trump said slowly, "represents years of concerns. Serious concerns. Concerns about fraud, concerns about corruption, concerns about how certain individuals came to power in this country." Omar let out a strangled gasp. Her senior advisor grabbed her arm. "Congresswoman, sit down. You need to sit down." But Omar couldn't sit, couldn't move, could barely breathe. Trump continued, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in, to hang on every word. "I'm not going to release the full details today. not on Thanksgiving, because today should be about family, about unity, about the things that bring us together. But let me be absolutely clear about something. He tapped the folder once. The sound echoed through the microphone. There are extremely serious questions surrounding Congresswoman Omar's rise to political power, questions about documentation, questions about statements made under oath, questions that many people in Washington have whispered about for years but were too afraid to voice publicly. The press room erupted in murmurs. Reporters frantically typed on their laptops. Camera operators zoomed in closer on Trump's face, on the folder, on the gravity of the moment. Trump raised his hand and the room fell silent again. Today, on Thanksgiving morning, Congresswoman Omar decided to call my warning to respect America trash. She called me a coward. But let me ask you, America, who is the real coward? Is it the man standing here, willing to defend his country no matter the political cost? Or is it the woman who has spent the last hour making frantic phone calls because she fears what might be revealed? Omar collapsed into her chair. Her face had gone completely white. Tears streamed down her cheeks, though she made no sound. Her staff exchanged terrified glances. One younger aide, who had believed deeply in Omar's mission, quietly began to cry. In homes across America, the emotional response was overwhelming. In South Carolina, a family of 4 sat holding hands around their television, tears falling freely. A grandmother in Arizona pressed her hand to her chest, whispering prayers. A young Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton watched on his phone, his jaw clenched, his eyes wet. Trump placed both hands on the podium, steadying himself, gathering his thoughts for the conclusion that would cement this moment in history. "I love this country," he said simply. "I love it more than I can express. I love the people who built it. I love the veterans who defended it. I love the immigrants who came here legally, worked hard, and became proud Americans. I love the mothers and fathers teaching their children to respect the flag. I love the teachers, the farmers, the truckers, the nurses, everyone who makes this nation great." His voice grew stronger with each word. "And I will not stand by silently while anyone disrespects it." The message was clear. The line had been drawn. Trump stepped back from the podium. No questions, no elaboration. He had said what needed to be said. As he turned to leave, the entire press corps sat in stunned silence. No one shouted questions. No one moved. They simply watched him walk away, understanding that they had just witnessed something rare in modern politics: authenticity. The moment the press room doors closed behind President Trump, reality crashed down on the nation like a collapsing building. Network anchors sat speechless, struggling to find words adequate to describe what had just occurred. Political analysts, many of whom had built careers on dissecting and criticizing Trump, found themselves oddly silent, unable to deploy their usual talking points against a display of such raw, unfiltered patriotism. In living rooms, kitchens, and dining rooms across America, the emotional response was instantaneous and overwhelming. A single father in Oklahoma, a veteran of the Gulf War, sat with his 8-year-old daughter on his lap. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he held her close. "Daddy, why are you crying?" she asked innocently. "Because, baby," he whispered, his voice breaking, "that man just reminded me why I wore the uniform." In Arizona, at a VFW hall where a group of elderly veterans had gathered for a modest Thanksgiving meal, the room erupted in something between applause and sobbing. Men in their 70s and 80s, warriors who had seen horrors most Americans couldn't imagine, stood with tears in their eyes, some saluting the television screen, others embracing each other without words. One man, a decorated Vietnam veteran with a silver star on his worn jacket, simply whispered, "That's my president." A young nurse in New Jersey, working a holiday shift at a busy hospital, watched the replay on her phone during her break. She was the daughter of Iranian immigrants who had fled persecution, who had come to America with nothing, and built a successful life through hard work and determination. She had always been politically moderate, sometimes voting Democrat, sometimes Republican. But as she watched Trump defend the country that had given her family everything, she felt something crack open inside her chest. Her colleagues found her crying in the staff lounge, unable to articulate the complex emotions washing over her. Small apartment in Chicago, a newly naturalized citizen from the Philippines sat with his wife and 3 children. He had waited 7 years for legal immigration approval. 7 years of paperwork, interviews, fees, and uncertainty. When he finally received his citizenship, he had cried tears of joy and kissed the certificate as if it were sacred. Now, watching Trump's address, he stood and placed his hand over his heart. "Thank you, Mr. President," he said quietly in accented English. "Thank you for protecting what we worked so hard to earn." But while millions of Americans felt their hearts swell with emotion, in Minnesota, Ilhan Omar's world was disintegrating. Her office had become a pressure cooker of panic and recrimination. Phones rang incessantly, but no one answered them. Email inboxes overflowed with messages, most of them angry, many of them from constituents who had supported her in previous elections. Even some in her own Somali-American community, people who had initially celebrated her rise to Congress, now questioned whether she truly represented their values of gratitude and respect for their adopted homeland. Omar sat slumped in her chair, mascara running down her face in black streaks. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. She had built her political career on being uncompromising, on never backing down, on positioning herself as a fearless voice against establishment power. But now, confronted with the raw emotional response from millions of Americans, she felt something she had never felt before in her political life: true fear. Her senior advisor, who had been frantically working her phone, finally lowered it and looked at Omar with something approaching pity. "Congresswoman," she said softly, "every major news network is running segments on the reaction to Trump's address. People are crying. They're sharing personal stories. Veterans, immigrants, families. This isn't a typical political news cycle. This is something else." "What are they saying about me?" Omar asked, her voice barely audible. The advisor hesitated. "That you disrespected America on Thanksgiving Day. That you called the president trash when all he did was ask for respect for the country. That you've lost touch with the values of gratitude and patriotism." Omar closed her eyes. "What do I do?" she whispered. "I don't know," the advisor admitted. "I honestly don't know." For the first time in her career, there was no playbook, no strategy that could undo the damage. You can't spin away from genuine national emotion. You can't poll test your way out of millions of people feeling personally wounded by your words. Back at the White House, Trump had returned to the Oval Office. His senior staff expected to find him energized, perhaps even jubilant about the impact of his response. Instead, they found him standing at the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the darkening sky. "Sir," one aide ventured, "the response has been overwhelming. People are saying they've never felt anything like this from a president." Trump didn't turn around. He simply nodded slowly. Another aide continued, "Social media is exploding. Not with political arguments, but with personal stories. People sharing why America matters to them. Families talking about sacrifice and service." "It's remarkable." Trump remained silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice quieter than anyone in the room had ever heard from him, he said, "I didn't do this for political gain. I did it because it needed to be said. Someone had to stand up and say that disrespecting America has consequences." His chief of staff, a former general who had served multiple presidents, stepped forward. "Sir, if I may, you reminded people of something they had forgotten. You reminded them that loving your country isn't old-fashioned or naive. You gave them permission to feel patriotic again without apology." Trump turned from the window. His eyes were red-rimmed, though he would never acknowledge why. The weight of the moment, the responsibility he felt, the genuine love he had for the nation he led, it all showed in his face. "She called me a coward," Trump said quietly. "But the real courage is standing in front of the entire country and defending something bigger than yourself." The room fell silent. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall on the White House lawn. Inside homes across America, families were having conversations they hadn't had in years. Parents talked to their children about what America meant. Teenagers who had grown up cynical about patriotism suddenly found themselves curious about their grandparents' stories of service and sacrifice. Dinner tables that usually avoided political discussions found themselves engaged in heartfelt conversations about national identity, gratitude, and respect. Something fundamental had shifted in the national consciousness. Trump's response hadn't been a political speech. It had been a moral statement, a reminder that some values transcend politics, that some principles are worth defending regardless of party affiliation. And millions of Americans, exhausted by years of division and cynicism, found themselves hungry for exactly that kind of leadership. In Minnesota, as evening approached and Thanksgiving dinners grew cold on tables across the state, Omar sat alone in her darkening office. Her staff had finally left, unable to offer any meaningful comfort or guidance. She stared at her phone, at the thousands of notifications she couldn't bear to read. For the first time, she wondered if she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She had assumed Trump would either ignore her or respond with typical political bluster that she could easily counter. She had not anticipated this. She had not anticipated that he would transform a personal attack into a national moment of reflection about American identity. She had not anticipated that millions of people would respond not with partisan fervor but with genuine emotional pain at seeing their country disrespected. And most of all, she had not anticipated the folder, the unnamed documents Trump had held, the veiled references to questions about her past, the implication that there were revelations still to come. Omar knew what could be in those files. She had always known. There were decisions made during her rise to power, statements given, documents signed, actions taken that she had hoped would remain buried beneath the noise of political theater. But Trump had just signaled to the entire nation that he was willing to bring everything into the light. As rain began to fall on her window, Omar finally allowed herself to cry without restraint. Not tears of anger or defiance, but tears of someone who had just realized that they had gone too far, pushed too hard, and now stood on the edge of consequences they couldn't escape. The evening news cycles would be brutal. The morning newspapers would be worse. But the true damage had already been done. Trump had succeeded in reframing the narrative entirely. This was no longer about immigration policy or political disagreement. It was about basic respect for the nation that had welcomed refugees, provided opportunities, and asked for nothing in return except gratitude and loyalty. And Ilhan Omar, in a moment of reckless anger on Thanksgiving morning, had shown neither. The backlash would not fade. The emotional response from millions of Americans would not diminish. And the folder on Trump's desk would remain a sword hanging over her head, a reminder that some fights cannot be won, some opponents should not be provoked, and some values are too deeply rooted in the American heart to be dismissed as trash. As the Thanksgiving evening deepened and the rain grew heavier over Washington, Trump stood on the Truman balcony, alone with his thoughts. A Secret Service agent stood at a respectful distance, giving the president space. The city lights below twinkled through the falling rain, each light representing a family, a story, a life lived in the nation Trump had sworn to protect. He thought about the veterans watching tonight, men and women who had sacrificed everything for the flag Omar had disrespected. He thought about the immigrants who had come legally, who had waited patiently, who had worked tirelessly to earn their place in American society. He thought about the children who would grow up learning about this moment, about what it means to defend your country with conviction and love. And he thought about Ilhan Omar, sitting alone in her office, realizing too late that words have consequences, that disrespect has a price, and that the American people, when truly moved, possess a moral clarity that no political maneuvering can overcome. The rain fell harder. Thunder rolled in the distance. But Donald Trump stood unmoved, a solitary figure against the storm, having done what he believed necessary to defend the soul of his nation. And across America, millions of people slept that night with a feeling they hadn't experienced in years. The feeling that someone in power actually loved their country enough to fight for it. The feeling that patriotism still mattered. The feeling that America, despite all its challenges and divisions, was worth defending. Thanksgiving 2025 would be remembered not for the meal or the parades, but for the moment a president reminded his people what it meant to be American. And for Ilhan Omar, it would be remembered as the day she discovered that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. The morning after Thanksgiving arrived with an eerie stillness. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving the streets of Washington washed clean but heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Across America, families woke to a fundamentally changed political landscape. The emotional earthquake triggered by Trump's response continued to send aftershocks through every corner of the nation. Major newspapers, which had gone to print before Trump's address, scrambled to update their online editions. The New York Times homepage featured a rare above-the-fold analysis piece titled simply, "A Nation Responds." The Washington Post led with interviews from Americans of every background, every political persuasion, all expressing variations of the same sentiment. Whether you support Trump or not, his defense of America touched something deep. Even international media picked up the story. BBC News ran segments showing the American reaction. Al Jazeera, interestingly, featured interviews with Somali American communities in Minnesota, many of whom expressed embarrassment at Omar's comments. A Somali American business owner named Ahmed told the camera she does not speak for us. "We came here grateful. We remain grateful. This country gave us life." In Omar's congressional office, the morning brought no relief. Her staff arrived to find protesters already gathering outside, not the typical political activists, but ordinary citizens. A Somali American woman held a sign reading, "I'm an immigrant and I love America." A veteran in a wheelchair held another, "Respect costs nothing. Disrespect costs everything." These weren't organized demonstrations. They were spontaneous expressions of hurt and disappointment. Inside, Omar sat at her desk having barely slept. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Her phone showed 347 missed calls. Her email inbox had exceeded its capacity. And worst of all, the political calculations were becoming brutally clear. Her communications director entered carrying a folder, his face grave. "Congresswoman," he began carefully, "I've compiled the overnight data." Omar looked up, dreading what was coming. "3 members of your original coalition have issued statements distancing themselves from your comments. 12 major donors have suspended their support. Your approval rating in district polling dropped 23 points overnight." Omar's face crumbled. "How is that even possible?" "Because this wasn't political," the director said quietly. "People took this personally. Trump made it about values, not policy. You can't poll your way out of that." But the most damaging development was yet to come. At exactly 9 a.m. Eastern Time, the White House press secretary stepped up to the podium for an emergency briefing. The press room was packed beyond capacity, with reporters standing along the walls, cameras from every major network positioned for optimal angles. The press secretary, a composed woman who had weathered countless media storms, looked unusually serious as she arranged her notes. "Good morning," she began. "I have a brief statement from President Trump, and then I'll take limited questions." She cleared her throat and read from the official statement. "Yesterday, on Thanksgiving Day, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar called the president's America First expulsion order trash and called the president a coward. In response, President Trump addressed the nation, not in anger, but in defense of the American values of respect, gratitude, and patriotic duty. The response from the American people has been overwhelming and deeply moving. The president has received thousands of messages from citizens thanking him for defending their country and reminding them that loving America is not only acceptable but necessary." She paused, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. President Trump wants to make clear that he takes no pleasure in the current situation involving Congresswoman Omar. However, he believes the American people deserve answers to serious questions that have surrounded her political career. Therefore, the president has directed the Department of Justice to conduct a comprehensive review of documentation and statements related to Congresswoman Omar's immigration history, marriage records, and campaign finance activities. The press room exploded. Reporters shouted questions over each other. Cameras flashed frantically. The press secretary raised her hand for silence. "This is not a political prosecution. This is simply ensuring that all public officials, especially those who hold the public trust in Congress, have followed the law. The American people deserve leaders with integrity." In Minnesota, Omar heard the announcement and felt the room spin. Her senior advisor grabbed her arm to steady her. "This is it," Omar whispered. "He's actually doing it. He's going to expose everything." The legal implications were staggering. If the Department of Justice found evidence of fraud in her immigration applications, marriage documentation, or campaign finance reports, she could face federal charges. Her congressional seat would be in jeopardy. Her entire political career could collapse. But beyond the legal consequences, the moral and emotional damage was already done. Trump had succeeded in positioning himself as the defender of American values, while painting Omar as someone who disrespected the very nation that had given her refuge and opportunity. The narrative was set, and no amount of political maneuvering could change it. Throughout that day, the emotional responses continued to pour in. Teachers across the country reported that students were asking questions about patriotism, about what it means to be American, about why respect for your country matters. Parents found themselves having conversations they hadn't expected to have for years, explaining complex ideas about loyalty, gratitude, and the social contract between citizens and their nation. In a fourth-grade classroom in Tennessee, a teacher asked her students to write about what America meant to them. A young boy whose grandparents had immigrated from Vietnam wrote, "America is where my family became safe. My grandpa says we should thank America every day. I think he's right." The essay was shared on social media by his mother and went viral, accumulating millions of views. People didn't share it because it was political. They shared it because it was true. Meanwhile, Trump spent the day after Thanksgiving at Mar-a-Lago, largely out of the public eye. But those close to him reported that he seemed reflective, almost somber. He had achieved what many considered a decisive political victory, but it had come at the cost of exposing deep wounds in the American consciousness. Later that afternoon, Trump made an unannounced visit to a local veterans of foreign wars post in Florida. The veterans, many of them elderly men who had served in Korea and Vietnam, stood when he entered. Trump spent over an hour with them, listening to their stories, shaking every hand, posing for countless photographs. One elderly veteran, his hands gnarled with arthritis, his chest decorated with fatting ribbons, pulled Trump aside. "Sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "what you said yesterday about loving this country, about expecting respect. You gave us permission to feel proud again. We've been made to feel like our patriotism was outdated, like loving America was somehow wrong. You reminded us it's not." Trump placed his hand on the old man's shoulder. "No one should ever be ashamed of loving their country," he said quietly. No one. The moment was captured by a photographer and would later appear in hundreds of newspapers and websites. The image showed two men, one the most powerful person in the world, the other a forgotten warrior from a forgotten war, connected by a simple, profound truth: America was worth loving, worth defending, worth fighting for. As evening approached, analysis pieces began appearing in major publications. Political scientists struggled to categorize what had happened. This wasn't a typical political conflict. Trump hadn't attacked Omar on policy grounds. He had confronted her on moral and emotional terrain, and he had won decisively. A Harvard professor of political science wrote, "President Trump accomplished something rare in modern politics. He shifted the conversation from partisan disagreement to fundamental values." By framing Omar's comments as disrespect for America itself, rather than simply criticism of his policies, he tapped into a deep well of patriotic sentiment that transcends traditional political divisions. The professor continued, "What makes this moment significant is that millions of Americans who don't typically support Trump found themselves agreeing with him. Not because they suddenly embraced his politics, but because they couldn't deny the basic premise that America deserves respect from its leaders, especially from those who came here seeking refuge." By the end of that day, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted. Omar's political future was in serious jeopardy. Trump's standing, particularly among veterans, immigrants who had come legally, and Americans who felt their patriotism had been dismissed for too long, had reached new heights. But perhaps most significantly, the nation had engaged in a collective conversation about identity, loyalty, and what it means to be American. Families had talked about it over leftover turkey. Friends had debated it on social media, though notably, many of these debates were less partisan and more philosophical than typical political arguments. Churches planned to address it in sermons. Schools would incorporate it into civics lessons. The confrontation between Trump and Omar had become a national teaching moment. As night fell on that day after Thanksgiving, Omar sat alone in her home, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She knew what was coming. The Department of Justice investigation would be thorough. Reporters would dig into every aspect of her past. Opponents would pounce on any inconsistency. And through it all, Trump's words would echo, "Who is the real coward?" She had called him a coward for issuing an immigration enforcement order. But now she appeared to be the one afraid, afraid of scrutiny, afraid of transparency, afraid that the American people would learn truths she had worked hard to keep hidden. In Washington, Trump stood once again on the Truman balcony, this time under clear skies. The storm had passed, both meteorologically and metaphorically. The city lights sparkled below, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint sound of the Star-Spangled Banner playing, perhaps from a late-night television broadcast, perhaps from some patriotic gathering. He thought about the folder still sitting in his desk drawer. He thought about the investigation he had set in motion. He thought about the millions of Americans who had reached out to thank him for defending their country. And he thought about what lay ahead. The confrontation with Omar was far from over. The investigation would take months. The political ramifications would extend well into the next election cycle. But on this night, Donald Trump felt something he had felt before but never quite so intensely. He felt that he had done exactly what a president should do. He had defended his nation. He had stood up for its values. He had reminded his people that they had every right to expect respect from those who had been given the extraordinary privilege of American citizenship. The battle would continue, but the moral high ground had been claimed. And for Trump, that was what mattered most. The following weeks would prove even more consequential than that initial Thanksgiving confrontation. As December arrived, bringing with it the first snowfalls of winter and the approach of the Christmas season, the investigation into Ilhan Omar gained momentum with a methodical, devastating precision. The Department of Justice assigned a special task force, deliberately composed of career prosecutors with impeccable reputations and no obvious political affiliations. The White House wanted to ensure that any findings would be perceived as legitimate, based purely on evidence rather than partisan vendetta. This calculation proved strategically brilliant. When critics attempted to frame the investigation as political persecution, the composition of the task force made such accusations difficult to sustain. Meanwhile, Trump maintained a carefully calibrated public posture. He didn't tweet obsessively about Omar. He didn't mention her at every rally. Instead, he let the process unfold while focusing his public comments on broader themes of American values, legal immigration, and respect for the rule of law. This restraint, unusual for Trump, made his occasional mentions of the situation all the more impactful. In early December, during a speech at a naturalization ceremony where new citizens were being sworn in, Trump stood before a diverse group of immigrants from dozens of countries. The ceremony took place in the grand hall of a federal courthouse, American flags lining the walls, families watching with tears of joy as their loved ones took the oath of citizenship. After the official proceedings concluded, Trump was invited to speak. He approached the microphone and looked out at the newly minted Americans, many of them holding small American flags, all of them wearing expressions of profound gratitude. Today, Trump began, "You have become Americans. Not by accident of birth, but by choice. You chose this country, you waited patiently, you followed the rules, you learned our history, you embraced our values. And now you are fully, completely, proudly American." The audience erupted in applause. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Trump continued, "Nobody in this country will ever ask you to abandon your heritage or forget where you came from. But we do ask something simple. We ask that you love America. We ask that you respect the country that has welcomed you. We ask that you contribute to making this nation even greater." The words were pointed, though Omar's name was never mentioned. Every person in that room, every person watching the televised ceremony understood the implicit contrast. Here were immigrants doing it the right way, showing the right attitude, embracing the right values. A woman from the Philippines, newly sworn in, raised her hand during the question portion of the event. "Mr. President," she said, her English careful and accented, "my family waited 8 years to come here legally. 8 years of paperwork and interviews and fees. But we never complained because we knew America was worth waiting for. What do you say to people who don't respect this country after it has given them so much?" Trump's response would be replayed millions of times. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth, "I say that you represent the very best of America. You waited legally. You respected our process. You appreciated the opportunity. And I promise you this, as long as I'm president, people like you will always be honored and protected. But those who abuse the system, those who show contempt for the country that welcomed them, they need to understand there are consequences. The audience rose in standing ovation. The newly naturalized citizens waved their flags enthusiastically. And Ilhan Omar, watching from her office in Minnesota, felt another piece of her political armor crack and fall away. The contrast was devastating. Trump was surrounding himself with grateful immigrants, while she was portrayed as the ungrateful beneficiary of American generosity. The strategic brilliance of his approach was becoming clear. He wasn't just attacking her. He was redefining what American immigration should look like. By mid-December, the first leaks from the investigation began appearing in the press. Initially, they were vague, references to irregularities in documentation and questions about timeline consistency. But as days progressed, more specific details emerged. A Washington Post article, notably from a newspaper that had been highly critical of Trump, reported that investigators had found significant discrepancies between Omar's public statements about her immigration history and official documents. The article was careful, legally cautious, but the implications were clear. Another report from a Minneapolis television station included interviews with community members in Omar's district who claimed to have direct knowledge of questionable activities during her initial rise in local politics. These weren't political opponents. These were former allies, people who had worked with her, who had supported her, but who now felt compelled to speak. One man, a Somali-American community organizer who had helped in Omar's first campaign, spoke on camera with visible anguish. "I believed in her," he said. "I thought she would represent our community with honor. But there were things I saw, things I was told to ignore. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to hurt our community. But after what she said about President Trump, after she called America trash on Thanksgiving, I realized that staying quiet makes me part of the problem." The interview sent shockwaves through Minneapolis. If even members of her own community were turning against her, how could she survive? Omar's congressional colleagues began distancing themselves with increasing boldness. Initially, the separation was subtle. Statements like, "I don't agree with the Congresswoman's choice of words," or "I think we should focus on policy rather than personal attacks." But as the investigation deepened and public opinion solidified against her, the distancing became more pronounced. A prominent Democratic senator speaking at a town hall in his home state was asked about Omar. His response was telling. "Look," he said, "I believe in passionate advocacy. I believe in fighting for your principles. But there's a difference between criticizing policies and disrespecting the country itself. When you call America trash, when you dismiss the concerns of millions of patriots, you've crossed a line. And if the investigation finds evidence of legal violations, then consequences need to follow. The party is not going to protect anyone who has broken the law, regardless of their political value." The statement was carefully worded but unmistakable. Omar was being cut loose. The Democratic establishment, recognizing the political toxicity she had become, was preparing to sacrifice her if necessary. Throughout all of this, Trump maintained his methodical approach. He didn't gloat. He didn't engage in petty attacks. He simply continued governing while letting the investigation proceed. But he did make one more significant move. In mid-December, Trump invited a group of Iraqi and Afghan interpreters who had worked with American forces and later immigrated to the United States to the White House for a private meeting. These men had risked their lives to help American troops. Many had received death threats. Some had seen family members killed because of their cooperation with American forces. After the private meeting, Trump brought them into the Rose Garden for a brief public ceremony. The press was invited. Cameras captured the scene as Trump stood surrounded by these brave men, many of them now American citizens. "These gentlemen," Trump said, "represent everything good about immigration. They helped our soldiers. They risked everything for values they believed in. And when they came to America, they came with gratitude and respect. They didn't come here to attack our country. They came here to become part of it." He turned to the men standing beside him. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for your service, and thank you for showing America what good immigration looks like." One of the interpreters, a man named Samir who had survived 3 assassination attempts in Iraq, stepped forward. "Mr. President," he said in clear English, his voice shaking with emotion, "in my country, I saw what happens when people do not respect law, when they do not appreciate freedom. When I came to America, I promised myself I would never take this country for granted. What you said on Thanksgiving about respecting America, you were right. Anyone who cannot respect this country should not be here. The moment was powerful, authentic, and perfectly calibrated to reinforce Trump's message. Here was an immigrant, a Muslim immigrant, thanking Trump for demanding respect for America. The political optics were devastating to Omar's remaining defenders. How could they claim Trump was anti-immigrant when immigrants themselves were thanking him? How could they claim he was Islamophobic when Muslim interpreters stood beside him expressing gratitude? As Christmas approached, the investigation continued to build momentum. Rumors circulated that a formal report would be released in January, after the holidays. The contents remained officially confidential, but enough had leaked to make clear that the findings would be damaging, potentially career-ending. Omar made several attempts to shift the narrative. She gave interviews claiming she was being persecuted for her political views. She appeared on friendly news programs where sympathetic hosts allowed her to frame herself as a victim, but nothing seemed to work. The fundamental problem was that millions of Americans, including many who shared her political views on other issues, simply could not get past what she had said on Thanksgiving. Calling the president trash might have been politically survivable, but doing it on Thanksgiving and framing it as a dismissal of concerns about respecting America had struck a nerve that went beyond normal political conflict. A political science professor at Georgetown published an analysis that captured the situation perfectly. Congresswoman Omar made a fundamental miscalculation. She treated this as a typical political fight when it was actually a cultural and moral moment. President Trump understood this instinctively. He didn't respond as a politician. He responded as a defender of national identity. And in doing so, he tapped into something that transcends party affiliation, the basic human need to feel that one's country, one's home, is valued and respected. The professor continued, "What's remarkable is how many people who don't typically support Trump found themselves agreeing with him on this particular issue. That's because he framed it correctly. This wasn't about policy. It was about values. And on questions of values, especially patriotic values, Trump has always been most effective." As the year drew to a close, Washington insiders began speculating about what would happen in January. Would Omar be formally charged with any crimes? Would she resign before charges could be filed? Would the House move to expel her if the investigation findings were sufficiently damaging? Trump, for his part, remained focused on governing. He signed year-end legislation. He held strategy meetings about the upcoming State of the Union address. He spent Christmas at Mar-a-Lago with family. But everyone knew that January would bring a reckoning. The folder Trump had held on Thanksgiving Day, the documents he had referenced but not revealed, would finally be opened for the nation to see. And Ilhan Omar, who had once seemed destined for a long career as a progressive firebrand in Congress, now faced the very real possibility that her political life was about to end, brought down not by her policies, but by her own words, spoken in anger on a day when America expected gratitude. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly on the White House and families across America gathered for holiday celebrations, Trump stood once more on the Truman balcony. The lights of the national Christmas tree glowed in the distance. Carols played somewhere in the background. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The unexpected victory in 2016, the brutal 4 years of constant attacks, the controversial loss in 2020, the unprecedented comeback in 2024, and now this moment with Omar, where he had defended American values in a way that resonated across all the usual dividing lines. An aide approached quietly. "Sir," she said, "I just wanted to let you know the mail room has been overwhelmed with Christmas cards from citizens. Tens of thousands of them, and almost all of them mention your Thanksgiving address. People are thanking you for defending America." Trump nodded slowly. "That means more to me," he said quietly, "than any political victory, because it means they understand. They understand that loving your country isn't controversial. It's essential." The aide smiled and retreated, leaving Trump alone with his thoughts. Below, on Pennsylvania Avenue, a group of people had gathered near the White House fence. They weren't protesters. They were carolers, singing Christmas hymns, their voices carrying through the cold night air. Trump listened, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel something he rarely permitted: peace. The battle with Omar wasn't over. January would bring new challenges. But on this night, Donald Trump felt confident that he had done what was right, what was necessary, and what the American people deserved. He had defended their country. He had honored their values. And he had reminded everyone that some principles are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. As the carolers below began Silent Night, Trump turned from the balcony and walked back inside, ready for whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that when America needed someone to stand up for her, he had been there. And millions of grateful Americans would remember that for the rest of their lives. The folder on his desk would be opened soon enough. The truth would be revealed. Justice would take its course. But tonight was for gratitude, for reflection, for remembering why all of this mattered in the first place. Tomorrow, the fight would continue. But tonight, America was beautiful, and Donald Trump was proud to be her president. My friend, if this story moved you, if you felt the weight of those Thanksgiving moments, if you understood why millions of Americans responded with tears and gratitude, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button. Don't scroll past. Don't wait. Your like tells me this message matters, and it pushes this story to other people who need to feel something real again, who need to remember that loving America isn't shameful, it's essential. And if you felt the emotion in Trump's words, if you understood why Omar's attack cut so deep, if you want to be part of a community that values truth over spin, then subscribe right now. Because we're building something special here, a place where political theater gets stripped away, and we focus on the moments that truly matter, the moments that reveal character, that test conviction, that remind us what leadership actually looks like. Drop a comment below. Tell me what this story made you feel. Tell me if you remember where you were on that Thanksgiving morning. Tell me whether you think Trump handled it perfectly or if you would have done something differently. Your voice matters. Your perspective adds to this community. And if you really want to go deeper, if you want exclusive content that goes beyond what everyone else sees, join our membership. You'll get early access to stories, behind-the-scenes analysis, and content that will never appear anywhere else. This is your community. This is our movement. Let's grow it together, one truth at a time.